What are some common misconceptions about interpreting services?
Rapport International, professional translation and interpretation services.
Hey everyone, it's Nathan, the office coordinator here at Rapport International. I wanted to talk about 8 common misconceptions that we hear in the interpreting services industry. Before I started working with Rapport, these actually were a lot of misconceptions that I personally had as well. So I'm happy to share what I've learned working through Rapport International. The first one, and this is probably the most common one we hear, is that any bilingual person can interpret well. While that may be true, they can speak both the languages, there runs a big risk in certain settings. In formal settings, such as the medical setting, you run the risk of your bilingual person maybe not knowing the best way to translate certain words, or maybe not knowing the best way to handle certain situations. Professional interpreters are trained for specific situations. They're trained in ethics, in responsibilities, how to respond to different scenarios that might come up. These interpreters are also trained in medical terminology or in whatever field they're specializing in, whether it be legal or scientific. As you can imagine, when you have things that are costing you time and money, important medical information or important legal documents, you'll want to hire a trained interpreter to make sure your message gets across clearly and accurately. The second misconception that is pretty common to hear is that the speaking party should face the interpreter. This actually is not true. The speaking parties can face each other as they naturally would. They can speak as they normally would, even in the first person. See, that allows the interpreter to be a background facilitator, almost just like a telephone, where the interpreter is repeating exactly what each party is saying. So the interpreter will speak in first person as well. For example, if a medical patient says, "I am experiencing these symptoms," the interpreter will look at the doctor and repeat, "I am experiencing these symptoms." And then the interpreter will repeat the doctor's response. This allows these 2 speaking parties to have the most natural conversation that they can. The third misconception we hear about interpreting is that interpreters are interchangeable. And don't get me wrong, interpreters can be trained in multiple fields, in multiple settings. However, if you and your organization have a specific set of needs, then talk to your interpretation provider to see if you can acquire an interpreter with that specific skill set. Let me share a quick story that relates to this subject. Recently, Rapport International had the privilege of working with a biotech company, and they asked for interpretation with that field. Thankfully, one of our interpreters was highly qualified, and they were available to help. I sat in the first meeting with this company, and some of the words they were using, I had no idea what they meant in English. So imagine adding another language on top of that. You'll want an interpreter who is knowledgeable about the field that they're interpreting for, whether it's medical, legal, scientific, or business. I was sure thankful that our interpreter, who was helping facilitate the conversation, had experience in biotechnology. A fourth misconception that we hear a lot about is that interpreters don't need any preparation. Actually, a lot of trained and experienced interpreters enjoy preparing for the subject that they're about to interpret for. So if you're having a business presentation and you have a PowerPoint per se, feel free to send the PowerPoint to your language services provider. We'll send those notes to the interpreter so they can prepare for specific words, scenarios, phrases, or documents, and so they can feel best prepared to interpret for the limited English-speaking person. All right, what number are we on? 5? The fifth misconception that we hear about is that you can start the meeting as soon as all parties are gathered. This actually doesn't set you up for success. What you might want to do instead is give a little bit of time for the interpreter to introduce themselves. That way, you, the provider, and the interpreter can also take this time to lay down some foundational guidelines as to how the conversation will go. For example, the interpreter can sit here and they'll relay in first person what is being said. Things like that. The next misconception that we hear is that interpreters don't need continuing education or feedback. You'll actually find that the most successful interpreters in the industry are the ones that are continuing to develop their own skills. Languages are pretty fluid. They continue to change, words continue to change. And so it's awesome when you find an interpreter who is continuing to educate themselves not only on language, but on their cultural skills as well. And if you have any feedback, please do share with the agency. Many of our most successful interpreters are the ones who listen to feedback. New situations arise all the time. So the more that they can learn on how to handle these situations with different providers, the better they can become. The seventh misconception that we hear is that it's easy to get an interpreter anytime. Let me be the first to tell you, this is false. You want to make sure to let your language services provider know as far in advance as possible so we can be sure to reserve an interpreter for your time. Many of the most successful interpreters out there are independent contractors, meaning that they are in charge of their schedule themselves. So let us make sure that we can get them to your door, a qualified interpreter, a skilled interpreter, and an interpreter who is specialized in the field that you're asking for. Then the last misconception, we're finally to the eighth, and this is perhaps the biggest one that we hear, is that telephone interpretation or video interpretation are substitutes for in-person interpretation. Now, don't get me wrong, each has their own place, but you'll find that one is not necessarily a good substitute for the other. If you are sharing sensitive information, perhaps a medical diagnosis, then you want an in-person interpreter to be there, to be able to connect with your patient and to be able to allow the patient to have that face-to-face interaction. This is true for sensitive subjects, important interactions, long meetings. It's better to have an in-person interpreter so you don't have to deal with technical problems. Now, phone interpreting or video remote interpreting each have their place as well. If you need to make a quick phone call to set up an appointment, or if you need to bring in a video interpreter to do American Sign Language, for example, let your language services provider know, because each of those interpretation specialties have their own place. If you ever have any questions about any of those services or any of these misconceptions in general, give us a call or shoot us an email. We'll be happy to help. And as always, thank you for listening. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks so much.
If you found this video helpful, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe. If you like hearing fun language and culture facts and goofs, use the link below to subscribe to our bi-monthly Tidbit newsletter. And of course, visit our website for more information or to schedule a free translation assessment.